How is your sermon dressed? Might sound like a strange question, but I will explain. This is Malcolm Cox with Tuesday Teaching Tips, episode 337, and the 9th episode in our current series on biblical preaching, inspired by this terrific book, Biblical Preaching by Haddon Robinson. Get yourself a copy. And we're on the 9th chapter of the book today, which is called The Dress of Thought. The Dress of Thought. How is our thinking in our sermons dressed? Have you ever been dressed inappropriately for an event you went to? Rather embarrassing, isn't it? Sends the wrong signals, confuses the observers, and we get very embarrassed. Lessons that are badly dressed draw attention to the confused thought that led to that error, rather than keeping attention on the message itself. So what do we mean by dressing a lesson? Well, Haddon Robinson, in his excellent book, gives us the following subtitles to the chapter. He talks about strong transitions, which we will talk about in a moment, a clear style, meaning a clear outline, short sentences, simple sentence structure, and simple words, a direct and personal style, and a vivid style. So we'll talk a bit today about transitions and style. I'm not going to go through the chapter, of course, read the book for yourself, but I will highlight a couple of thoughts of my own on this, and particularly we'll start with transitions. Now, why do transitions matter? Well, they matter because a listener is in a different place from a reader. A listener needs stronger clues about the direction of thinking than a reader does. Somebody reading a text, if you're reading a Bible, for example, you can see the transition in front of you. You can see it right there, and you can reread the document. You can observe the transition, and you can go back and think about it if you need to. But in a lesson that's being taught, the listener is in a very different position. They need clear, audible prompting to notice the connection between your points. It may be clear in your mind, but you have to make it audibly clear to the person who's listening to you. A strong transition can make a big difference to carrying people with you throughout the entirety of your lesson. In the New Testament, you've probably noticed that often we see words like therefore. You find many in, for example, the book of Hebrews. Maybe have a look at the book of Hebrews with your Bible dictionary or something and look up the words therefore or words like it. And the placing of the words is always significant. The placing of those words gives people who are listening, because remember, these letters, for example, in the New Testament, were written to be read out. They weren't written to be read like we would read them today. And the placing of the words like therefore helps the listeners understand, okay, he's made a point, and now he's drawing a conclusion from that point of some kind, so let me listen up. A good example is found in the book of Romans. After discussing the very theological foundation of salvation in chapters earlier than chapter 12, Paul then gets to chapter 12 with a practical application of living a transformed life, what that really means. In Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, he says, therefore. So that therefore is predicated upon what he said in chapter 11 and 10 and 9 and others. And he says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, your true and proper worship. So now they're going to understand what true worship is based on what he's already said. But he's creating the link for them in an audible way that helps them to carry the thought across from the doctrinal teaching to the practical application. And that's what you and I do in our lessons when we say so, or in summary, or to put it another way, or therefore. We're helping the people listening to us. Makes a big difference. Your congregation will keep pace with you if you link your points with transitions. Otherwise, if you just jump from one point to another like some demented frog without a transition, they'll be trying to link your points in their own head. What did he just say? And what's he now said? How is that tied together? And what's going to happen to their attention? Their attention will be taken away from what you are now saying. And by the time they've caught up by creating their own transition, you're now halfway through your second point and they're not with you anymore. Take Jesus as another example. You can find many examples of transitions in the way that he taught. And for example, Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, he says, no one can serve two masters. He's making a declarative statement here. You'll hate the one and love the other. You'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And then what does he do? He says, therefore, verse 25, therefore. So I've made a statement of truth, but therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life. And he goes on to explain about that. Have a look at it in Matthew chapter 6. It's a really good transition and it makes sense. So that's the point about transition. Let's talk a little bit about style. Style can be neglected as an issue of significance because we might feel like it's about performance, and preaching isn't about performance. And you'd be right. It's not really about performance. But style is important because it's part of who you are. And as we've said once before, I think, one definition of preaching is truth through personality. You have a personality. God gave it to you or you developed it. I don't know quite now how that exactly works, but you have a personality and your speaking should reflect your personality. And you should use your style to create clarity and impact because it's you. Isn't it great to listen to different speakers? We might have our favorites. I'm sure I'm your favorite. Maybe not. But we have our favorites. But it's nice to hear other people preach and teach because we get different feelings from them through their different styles, different understandings. Now, all my sermons are to some extent or another a Malcolm sermon, but they do vary in style. For example, my sermons in Thames Valley are a bit different to my sermons typically in Watford. Some of them are very similar, but they are sometimes quite different. For example, in Thames Valley, I have interactivity in many of my lessons, but not quite as much as in my sermons in Watford overall. And the reason for that is simply the size of the group. The group in Thames Valley is bigger. In Watford, it's a bit smaller. Also, the room is bigger in Thames Valley, smaller in Watford. And that changes my style, my approach, if you like. It's still a Malcolm sermon, but I make adjustments for the context. So some of style is about your personality, who you are, and part of it is about the context. Do you have a style? A recognizable style that someone would say, yeah, that's them, that's how they speak. Now, when you're starting out, it's really not important. Don't worry about it if you don't have much experience just yet. But as time goes by, there should be something distinctive about your style. God's given you your personality. And of course, we're not aiming for a certain style for the sake of it, but because it reflects your personality, your context, who God has made you to be. Consider, for example, the difference between the majestic style of Isaiah, I have a reading of some of his writing, and the more emotionally charged style of Jeremiah. They were appropriate to be different. It was appropriate to who they were, but also to their circumstances. Finally, let's talk about clarity. Clarity. Now, I have many thoughts about clarity, and sometimes clarity is problematic because in trying to achieve clarity, we end up being too clinical and surgical. That's not the kind of clarity I'm talking about here, not like the precision of every single word, but more that what we're saying, the main points about what we're saying, come across clearly enough to have an impact. Whatever your style, it's important that it enhances the clarity of your message. It does not make it foggy. Does your message flow in a clear direction, for example, from point 1 to 2 to 3 or whatever? Do your subpoints make your overall point clearer? Do your transitions that we've been talking about link your points to create clarity? And what about your illustrations? Do they enhance clarity or just kind of confuse? Nice story, nice illustration, but doesn't really help. So how do we develop clarity, you may say? Well, let me suggest a few things. First step, write out your outline. Write it out, put it down on paper so you can look at it, because there's something about seeing your points and subpoints and where the illustrations fit and the scriptures are that help you to see whether they really flow and make sense one after another. The next step, of course, is to pray through that outline. Take it to God and say, God, help me refine this so that it's clear. Your truth is clear for the people I'll be speaking to. Something else I do, you may like to try this if you haven't done it before. In the week during and running up to the sermon I'm going to teach, I go for a walk. I go for a walk in the woods, which I do pretty much every day anyway, in my prayer walks, but I go out with my lesson either on a piece of paper in my pocket or perhaps on my phone or a device I'm carrying. I go out into the woods and I speak the outline out loud. Not every point, not every word of the sermon, but I speak the title out loud. I speak the main points and subpoints out loud. And I do them in the order that I'm going to be preaching in. And it's funny how often when I do that, I realize, oh, actually, that doesn't fit with that, or that should go in a different place, or that actually makes no sense, so let's just cut it out. It makes a big difference to grasping whether the lesson has adequate clarity or not. And the other thing I do similarly with that is I rehearse my main illustrations. Usually it's one. Sometimes I have more than one illustration, but there's usually one key illustration. And that's the one that I always rehearse. In the woods, with only the dogs, cats, some deer we have in our woods to listen to me, I do the illustration out loud while I'm walking along, aware of the presence of God and asking him to refine the illustration. And that's not so that I will then do the illustration word for word as I've done it in the woods. I'm not striving for that. But as I speak that illustration out loud, it creates greater clarity. And whether the way I'm sharing it will be clear or not. So does it make sense? And will it help everybody? Will it fit with the lesson? I find that tremendously helpful. And these exercises show me how to refine the points I have in my lesson and the illustrations so that they will have a more vivid impact. They might be true, they might be useful, but how much impact? I wonder how often, and we don't know, but I wonder how often Jesus rehearsed in his own head or out loud out there in the wilderness the story of the prodigal or one of his other parables. I reckon he practiced them a few times before he delivered them. I could be wrong. We'll have to ask him one day. Wrapping up. Test your transitions. If you're going to have a clear and impacting lesson, test those transitions. Are they helping your audience think along with you? Secondly, develop your style. Make the lesson your own. Allow your context and personality to influence your style. And thirdly, check for clarity. Dress and redress your sermon until clarity is achieved. If you do that, your sermons will have a great deal more impact. Just before we finish, I'd like to encourage you to consider joining the AIM UK and Ireland program to develop your understanding of Scripture. Currently, we've just finished homiletics, which is the preparation and delivery of lessons. We're going to be going on in the next module to talk about spiritual pastoral counseling and that kind of idea. You can find more information at the website, aimukанdireland.com, and you can contact us with inquiries on courses at aimukанdireland.com. Love to have you involved with us if you possibly can. If you've got any comments on today's episode, then please leave them where we can see them so we can learn from each other, because we learn best when we learn in community. If you have any questions about the Bible, drop me an email, malcolm@malcolmcox.org. And if you'd like a copy of my free ebook on spiritual disciplines called How God Grows His People, then sign up for my newsletter at the website, malcolmcox.org. If you know anybody that might benefit from this recording, please pass the link on, subscribe, leave a review, why not? And remember, at all times, to keep calm and carry on teaching. Take care, and God bless.